In the history of Europe, there were empires that ruled through laws, borders, and centralized authority. There were kingdoms built on bureaucracy, religion, and permanent institutions. And then there were forces that operated without a capital, without a unified state, and without permanent borders, yet managed to reshape the continent more deeply than many empires ever did. The Vikings were one of those forces. They did not arrive with the intention of ruling Europe. They arrived to disrupt it. They did not build cities first. They broke systems first. For centuries, European societies were structured around predictability, harvest cycles, feudal obligations, slow-moving armies, and defensive stone structures. The arrival of Viking expansion shattered these assumptions. Speed replaced predictability. Mobility replaced static defense. Psychological pressure replaced prolonged warfare. This was not accidental. It was structural. Geography and necessity. The Scandinavian peninsula was never an easy place to live. Long winters, limited arable land, rocky terrain, and short growing seasons defined daily life. Agricultural surplus was minimal. Population growth placed constant pressure on resources. Survival required efficiency, adaptability, and physical endurance. Communities that failed to adapt disappeared. Communities that adapted became harder. This environment produced societies that valued mobility over permanence, initiative over obedience, strength over hierarchy. The Vikings were not born violent. They were shaped by constraint. Scarcity does not create philosophy, it creates behavior. Social structure, flat but merciless. Contrary to many medieval European societies, Viking communities were not rigidly stratified. There were leaders, warriors, traders, and laborers, but social mobility was possible. Reputation mattered more than lineage. Ability mattered more than titles. Authority was earned through success in expeditions, distribution of wealth, ability to protect the group. A leader who failed repeatedly did not remain a leader. This produced a culture where initiative was rewarded, hesitation was punished, failure was remembered. Leadership was practical, not symbolic. Economy, rating as a system, not chaos. Viking expansion is often described as raiding, but this simplifies a complex economic mechanism. Raids were not random acts of violence, they were carefully timed, seasonally planned, intelligence-driven. Targets were selected based on weak defenses, accumulated wealth, slow response capabilities. Monasteries, coastal towns, river settlements, these were not attacked because of ideology, but because they represented high reward with minimal resistance. Loot was not just stolen. It was redistributed. This redistribution stabilized internal societies and funded further expansion. Violence was a means, not an identity. Naval superiority, the real revolution. The true advantage of the Vikings was not brutality. It was logistics. Their ships were lightweight, vast, capable of both open sea and shallow rivers. This eliminated traditional European defensive assumptions. A settlement protected by walls was safe from land armies. A settlement far inland was safe from sea attacks. The Vikings ignored these rules. They appeared where no enemy was expected. They disappeared before retaliation could be organized. This forced Europe to rethink defense entirely. Psychological warfare. One raid could destabilize an entire region. Not because of destruction, but because of uncertainty. Viking tactics relied on unpredictability, sudden appearance, rapid withdrawal. News traveled faster than armies. A single successful raid created fear that spread far beyond the actual area of attack. Settlements reinforced defenses, diverted resources, and disrupted local economies, all without the Vikings needing to return. Fear became a weapon. The myth of disorganization. European chroniclers often described Vikings as chaotic, savage, and irrational. This perception came from misunderstanding. Their structure was not centralized, but it was highly coordinated. Expeditions required resource pooling, agreed leadership, planned routes, clear objectives. This was not anarchy. It was distributed organization. A system without a capital, but not without order. Expansion without empire. The Vikings did not attempt to replace European governance structures. They exploited them. In some regions, they settled, intermarried, adopted local administrative systems. In others, they maintained a purely extractive presence. This flexibility allowed them to adapt to local conditions faster than rigid empires could. Where resistance was strong, they withdrew. Where opportunity existed, they stayed. Expansion was selective, not obsessive. Early European response: failure through slowness. European powers initially failed to respond effectively. Why? Armies were slow. Communication was fragmented. Command structures were rigid. By the time a response was organized, the Vikings were gone. Fortifications increased, coastal defenses expanded, river access points were guarded. But the system was always reacting, never anticipating. The Vikings controlled the tempo. The beginning of transformation. Over time, Viking activity forced structural change in Europe. Military organization evolved. Naval defense gained importance. Local governance strengthened. Ironically, Viking pressure accelerated European development. They did not just destroy systems. They forced them to evolve. Closing of Part 1. The Vikings were not merely raiders. They were not merely warriors. They were a mobile power structure operating outside traditional political frameworks. They did not conquer Europe by ruling it. They changed Europe by forcing it to adapt. And this was only the beginning. The end of small raids. In the early phase of Viking expansion, speed and surprise were enough. Small groups could strike, extract wealth, and vanish. But over time, this model reached its limits. Europe began adapting. Coastal settlements improved defenses. Local militias were organized faster. River access points were monitored. While still effective, isolated raids no longer produced the same level of disruption. The Vikings responded not by retreating, but by scaling up. Raids evolved into campaigns. This was a critical transformation. It marked the shift from opportunistic violence to strategic dominance. The rise of large expeditions. By the mid-expansion phase, Viking forces began to operate in numbers previously unseen. Instead of dozens of ships, fleets now consisted of hundreds of vessels, thousands of men, extended logistical support. These were no longer hit-and-run attacks. They were mobile armies. Such expeditions required long-term planning, supply coordination, internal discipline. This alone disproves the myth of Viking disorganization. You cannot move thousands across seas without structure. Temporary bases and winter CMPS. A decisive innovation was the use of seasonal and permanent bases. Previously, Viking forces returned north before winter. Now they stayed. They established fortified winter camps, river strongholds, coastal staging points. These bases allowed year-round pressure, repeated strikes into the same region. Control over key transport routes. Europe was no longer facing visitors. It was facing occupiers. Control of rivers, the hidden highway. Rivers were the arteries of medieval Europe. They connected trade centers, agricultural zones, political capitals. Viking mastery of river navigation allowed them to penetrate deep inland with minimal resistance. Once a river was controlled, trade could be taxed or disrupted. Reinforcements could be blocked. Entire regions could be isolated. Control of rivers meant control without walls. European defenses were built for land warfare. The Vikings bypassed them entirely. Adaptive warfare. Unlike rigid European armies, Viking forces adapted tactics rapidly. If resistance was strong, they avoided prolonged confrontation, redirected efforts elsewhere. If resistance was weak, they escalated, established dominance. This flexibility prevented resource exhaustion and maximized long-term effectiveness. They did not fight to prove strength. They fought to maintain advantage. Economic warfare. Viking campaigns were not only military, they were economic. By targeting trade hubs, supply centers, seasonal markets, they destabilized entire regions without conquering them outright. A city did not need to fall. It only needed to fail economically. This forced local rulers into negotiation, tribute, or submission. Power shifted not through banners, but through dependency. Permanent settlements. In certain regions, Viking forces transitioned from external pressure to internal presence. They settled strategically, near fertile land, along major rivers, beside trade routes. These settlements were not isolated colonies. They were integration points. Local systems were absorbed, not erased. This allowed Vikings to access local manpower, stabilize supply chains, exert long-term influence. Expansion no longer required constant movement. Leadership transformation. As operations expanded, leadership models evolved. Early expeditions relied on personal authority. Large-scale campaigns required delegation, coordination, long-term planning. Leadership became more structured, but still merit-based. A leader was expected to distribute resources fairly, protect followers, maintain momentum. Failure resulted in immediate loss of authority. This created a harsh but efficient command system. European COUNTRMESURES, too late, too slow. European rulers eventually attempted organized resistance. They built larger fortifications, river barriers, standing forces, but these measures were reactive. By the time defenses were in place, Viking influence had already reshaped regional power dynamics. Control had shifted from land-based authority to mobility-based dominance. Normalization of Viking power. Over time, Viking presence became a constant factor. European rulers adjusted strategies assuming Viking intervention, Viking negotiation, Viking retaliation. They were no longer anomalies. They were a permanent strategic variable. This normalization marked a turning point. Viking power was no longer shocking, it was expected. The cost of expansion. However, expansion carried its own risks. Large forces required steady resources, internal stability, predictable returns. As operations became more complex, internal competition increased. Power struggles emerged, leadership conflicts intensified, cohesion weakened. The very scale that created dominance began to create vulnerability. Transition phase. By the end of this phase, Viking activity had fundamentally changed. They were no longer defined by raids. They were defined by control, pressure, and integration. But this transformation also marked the beginning of a new challenge. Sustaining power is harder than acquiring it. Closing of Part 2. The Vikings had mastered movement, pressure, and adaptability. They forced Europe to respond on their terms. They controlled space without ruling it. They reshaped economies without occupying capitals. But dominance attracts resistance. And the next phase would test whether a system built on mobility could survive the demands of permanence.